Hello, it's Kevin Annett. It's March the 5th, 2016, and I'm here today to talk to you about the whole issue of the modern genocide in Canada related to the missing Aboriginal women, missing people generally, but especially the Native women and children who continue to go missing, especially in Western Canada on the Pacific Coast. Now, I'm basing this on part in information and the analysis in our latest book, Murder by Decree, The Crime of Genocide in Canada, but also in response to the latest move by the Canadian government to once again co-opt this whole issue and avoid looking at the bigger reasons behind these disappearances and this ongoing genocide. Now, 15 years ago, this last week, we published the first account of genocide in Canada, Hidden from History, the Canadian Holocaust. This small report has grown into the 400-page Murder by Decree, based on hard evidence that we accumulated often in British Columbia, where a lot of these crimes are ongoing. The very same week that our first report came out in 2001, a woman named Wendy Poole disappeared on the streets of Vancouver. Wendy Poole was one of the first Native women to, quote, officially go missing. What wasn't talked about in the media was that she was actually a hereditary chief from a clan mother line. Her uncle, Art Napoleon, had been leading very successful land occupations in Moberly Lake district of northern British Columbia and had fought corporations up there and successfully won their land back. In other words, she was targeted for disappearance and killing. Her body had actually been dismembered and killed in apparently a ritualistic manner, although that never made it into the media or police reports. That was described by people on the scene who found her body, some of the local police, and her family members. Now, Wendy Poole's death compelled us to first look into the whole issue of genocide in Canada, not just about residential schools, but how Native people are continually targeted, especially traditionalists who are staying on their land. We know that they're being targeted today by the same corporate interests and new corporations, especially in northern British Columbia, involving Chinese cartels. This is information that's come out over the last few years. In other words, the disappearance of Native women today is not isolated or separated from, in any way, from the whole history of genocide that's ongoing in Canada. These are not random killings, but racially targeted murders. And in response, of course, the Canadian government is trying to do like they did with the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission and make it look like these are unrelated crimes. I want to read from the part of our report, Murder by Decree, the section on page 140 starting Disappeared Women and Children. According to former RCMP Constable George Brown, who set up their own community inquiry in the downtown east side of Vancouver that I took part in the early years of the 21st century, George Brown says, quote, "There's a pattern to the disappearances of all these women. We found that they're mostly related by blood to the clan mothers from up north who were the original holders of the land. This is planned racial targeting to get the land." Now, for many years, the RCMP and corporate media contained and camouflaged the fact that hundreds of Aboriginal women and their children were vanishing along the corridor known as the Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia, Highway 16 between Terrace and Prince George. Since the late 1980s, when stories of missing West Coast women first appeared in cursory media coverage, the RCMP has consistently ignored media missing persons requests filed by Aboriginal families. Under pressure, the RCMP eventually produced a media cover story that claimed that only 16 women could not be accounted for, a number that stayed constant over the years, despite escalating reports of disappearances, not just along Highway 16, but all over the province. Even as recently as 2014, the RCMP have claimed that over 32 years, only 40 unsolved Aboriginal female murders and 36 missing cases in which foul play was suspected have occurred in all of British Columbia, probably about 10% of the actual number of disappearances. Now, George Brown again, to quote him, "Their official line bore all the typical signs of an organized cover-up, like right out of the old residential school days. I knew right away that an order was coming down to steer attention away from where and why the killings were happening, because a wall of silence came down whenever I tried finding out these things, to trace a pattern between the disappearances. None of the RCMP officers I worked with were allowed to go past a certain point, even after we started investigating the missing women. That woke me up that somebody was being covered for." Well, frustrated and alarmed, George Brown, after he retired for the RCMP, gathered a handful of friends together, and they called themselves the Community Inquiry into Missing People, which started in the downtown east side of Vancouver in the spring of 1999. Their investigation began among the mostly Aboriginal street people in that neighborhood, and many of the prostitutes who themselves were targeted and subsequently disappeared. Now, in so doing, they encountered my work and the work I was doing in the same neighborhood with residential school survivors. We joined forces, and what we found is that the disappearances in the residential schools were often very related to what then happened subsequently with the Native people who were being killed on the street. Now, based on their own investigations, the New York-based group Human Rights Watch actually issued two reports in 2007-2013 that confirmed that Aboriginal people were being systematically targeted by Vancouver police for rape, torture, and disappearance. But they never drew the connection between those disappearances and the whole pattern of genocide in the province. Interestingly, Human Rights Watch was actually founded by George Soros, the multi-billionaire who himself has been named as a participant in satanic ritual killings, and that also is covered in our report. Brown's group and the work I was doing with him in the downtown east side, we began to do background checks into the actual women going missing, and sure enough, time and again, these women were from traditional matriarchal families in northern British Columbia. One of the women we worked with, Carol Martin, who worked at the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, said this: "It's not just our women who are going missing. Whole families are disappearing, starting with the children. Our northern communities are being wiped out for their land by big corporations and their hired RCMP thugs. It's the residential school genocide taken to its next step." Now, Carol Martin, in her work, described how the common pattern involving how whole families disappear in British Columbia was, first of all, the children are targeted and unlawfully abducted by social services under some flimsy pretext. Ministry of Children and Families, which itself was actually run by accused child trafficker Chief Ed John between 2000 and 2002. After the children are abducted in this way by the child services, any complaints or non-cooperation from the parents causes them to be arrested, and then often the whole family will simply disappear. This occurs through direct collusion between the RCMP social services and the forces funding these disappearances. And we'll talk about who those people are in a minute. Now, I found a similar pattern working as a street minister in Vancouver in the 1980s and 90s, when constantly homeless people were being disappeared. I spoke with locals who actually saw homeless people being loaded in the back of police vans. Those people were never seen again, and when we inquired with the police, they had no record of these people. So these disappearances are not just confined to Native people. It's a common pattern among any targeted group like the homeless or others. Now, very craftily, in the same manner that the Indian residential school issue was reduced to a matter of apology and compensation, the continued slaughter of Aboriginal women and children has been reduced by the media and the government to an issue surrounding one man, supposed serial killer Willie Pickton. But according to sources like former Canadian Security Intelligence agent Grant Wakefield, who I interviewed on 2 occasions, Pickton had been made a deliberate scapegoat by the courts and government to distract attention away from a network of police, judges, and politicians who were preying on and killing Native women and children on the West Coast. The overt corruption and manipulation surrounding the Pickton trial and the demands of victim families to reopen the case that were ignored had been completely ignored by the media. And this is not coincidental. So the reality is that Pickton, as the required lone gunman, is drawing attention away from forces behind these disappearances. And these people include prominent Canadian senators. The names Larry Campbell and Patrick Brazeau came up time and again, according to the witnesses. According to Grant Wakefield, the CSIS agent who infiltrated Pickton's farm where apparently the women were being killed, Dave and Willie Pickton were simply the disposal crew, the body disposal crew. They themselves never actually killed or raped anyone. They simply disposed of the bodies. The actual killings were occurring in a very wealthy mansion in Port Coquitlam, about a mile away from Piggy's Palace, the supposed killing center. And these Killers included Canadian senators, military people, and corporate and political leaders, including a number of people from Chinese and American corporations with interests in northern British Columbia. We've learned subsequently from various reporters and terrorists that yes, in fact, Chinese corporate interests are behind a lot of these disappearances now, operating with private death squads working in collusion with the RCMP. Part of the reason is that there's a whole process of immigration and colonization happening with Chinese settlers coming in and occupying lands in northern British Columbia. They have to get rid of native people in the process. In other words, performing the same role historically that English settlers did in that area, now under a Chinese mantle. Well, in conclusion, the work of the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State and the disappearance of inquiry that's going on now comes down to a simple issue that we cannot rely on the government or existing bodies, which the Trudeau government has announced in their missing inquiry that they're going to rely on the very forces that have caused these disappearances in the first place, such as the RCMP and the local police. Citizens themselves need to launch their own inquiry, but it has to be backed up with their own common law courts that, as we have done in Europe already, can lay charges against people in church and state and corporations, can perform citizen arrests, bring these people into trial, and then enforce the warrants through our own common law sheriffs and community action groups that actually protect our women and our children. These are the concrete steps of activation of citizens that we're involved with now. And if you'd like to be involved in this, please write to us, itcccsoffice@gmail.com. You can write to me, hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com, or follow our work, itccs.org, and especially acquire the book Murder by Decree, Crimes of Genocide in Canada, available at amazon.com or createspace.com. This is Kevin Annett. I'll be back with more updates soon. Thank you very much.